There's a theory of housing that says that the problem we're facing is fundamentally not a lack of homes or restrictions on building and density. Instead, we face a scourge of investors who buy homes not to live in but to rent out, taking away options from aspiring homebuyers and forcing them into renting. As one commenter on our channel argued, the investors are the prime cause of this housing crisis. Let's stop the gaslighting and verbal gymnastics. What we really need then is to encourage homeownership and clamp down on investors who outbid first-time homebuyers. Take out the demand from investors and you have more than enough supply, which drives costs down. According to another distinguished commenter on one of our videos, clamping down on investors is exactly what Rotterdam in the Netherlands tried to do. Here's how it turned out.
In 2019, almost 20% of homes in the Netherlands were bought with the intention of renting them out, climbing to around 30% in major urban areas. In 2021, the Dutch government introduced a law allowing municipalities to ban buying a home to rent it out, in order to give regular home buyers a leg up over investors. Rotterdam was the first major municipality in the country to make use of this option, applying it to 16 of the city's 71 neighborhoods, covering about a third of the population of the city, mostly just outside of the city center where investor activity was higher. That's an opportunity to study the effect of the law by comparing what happens in regulated neighborhoods after the law takes effect with nearby neighborhoods where the law doesn't apply.
Here's how Rotterdam explains this purchase protection or buyout protection policy, which applies to houses and apartments with a tax-assessed value under 405,000 euros. Many people who want to buy a house cannot. This is because there are investors who want to pay more for the same house and start renting them out for a lot of money. Rental houses are often only rented out for a short time. Neighbors often do not know each other at all, and that is not a pleasant way to live. This policy will give people more chances to buy a house for a reasonable price. For example, people who are buying a house for the first time, or people who do not have that much money. So, how well did the policy work? We actually have two studies here. Both studies looked at the effect of the new policy on home prices. With investors out of the way, do home prices fall to become more affordable? Both studies found the same result. No. At least in the year or so after the policy came into effect that they had data for, kicking investors out of these neighborhoods did not actually seem to bring prices down for homebuyers.
The second study went further and looked into other effects of the law. While it didn't reduce the price to buy a home, it did increase the home ownership rate and decrease rental availability. This raised rents by 4% in Rotterdam and changed the demographics of the regulated neighborhoods. With more homeowners and fewer renters, these neighborhoods started to shift to become older, wealthier, and more likely to be native-born Dutch instead of immigrants. In other words, trying to limit investors seems to have encouraged gentrification. The study concluded, while the ban-induced shift in purchases from investors to owner-occupants has enhanced homeownership access for middle-income households, it has curtailed housing opportunities for lower-income rental households.
It feels like we see articles every few weeks about how much of Canada's housing stock is bought by investors, followed by a long list of commenters explaining that there's no point in building more housing if it's just going to get scooped up by investors as part of their portfolio, instead of being a place to live for regular people. There are multiple problems with this. First, new housing developments do usually come with significant opportunities for ownership. This census tract covering Yaletown in Vancouver is 54% owner-occupied. This census tract covering most of City Place in Toronto is 39% owner-occupied. And this census tract in Montreal's Griffintown is 55% owner-occupied. These are all relatively new developments that people associate with investors that provide owned homes for literally thousands of families.
The second and maybe bigger problem is that people talk about investors taking homes off the market as if they make housing disappear and rentals don't really count as housing. The problem is that, on top of the reasons someone might actually prefer to rent, like not worrying about maintenance, keeping the flexibility to move, or not wanting to tie up so much of their money in one illiquid asset in one housing market, rentals are actually really important for making housing accessible to people who just aren't in a financial position to own. As we saw in these Rotterdam results, Laws that encourage homeownership and reduce the availability of rentals don't necessarily open up homeownership to lower-income people. They can have the effect of excluding lower-income people and pushing them out.
The scary thing is that this isn't always unintentional. There are absolutely lots of people who identify investors as the source of the housing crisis, rightly or wrongly, out of a genuine concern for regular people and first-time homebuyers. But we've also followed enough public consultations on new developments and housing policies to know that there's a really pervasive anti-renter sentiment out there.
And I've seen cities of renters, and it's ugly.
A lot of people are genuinely excited at the prospect of using the law to exclude renters, who are on average younger, lower income, and more likely to be immigrants, from their neighborhoods. There's a thin and blurry line between anti-investor sentiment and anti-renter sentiment. A lot of the rhetoric about how we need housing for people, not investors, is, intentionally or not, sending the message to renters that because they don't own where they don't really live in a home. They live in someone else's investment.
Whenever we stress the importance of rentals, we get people responding by saying that, okay, maybe rentals are useful, but the private rental market is exploitative. Rentals should be provided by government and nonprofits. And we completely support a greater role for nonprofit and non-market housing. But you achieve that by actually funding and building nonprofit housing, not by limiting the private rental market and hoping things will work out. In the end, this was just a couple of studies on one country's policies. It's possible that other laws designed differently could have a different effect, or that we'll learn more about the effect of this Dutch policy in the coming years. But right now, we think it's much more productive and less likely to have unintended consequences on lower-income renters if we focus on building more housing, both market rate and nonprofit, instead of trying to shift housing around from renters to buyers.
We actually agree that the mindset of housing as an investment can be extremely corrosive, but it's important to be clear what we mean. We can think about three main ways to make money from housing. You can make money from building housing, from renting it out, or from simply owning it and seeing its value appreciate. As far as we're concerned, that's the order from most productive to least socially useful. The idea that a person or company would make money from building housing doesn't bother us at all. NIMBYs sometimes decry allowing more housing construction as a giveaway to developers, but that's like saying that allowing land to be used for farming is a giveaway to farmers. They're creating something that people want and need. Isn't that the best way to make money? One step down is renting out housing. You're not necessarily creating anything new, physically speaking, unless you actually finance the construction. But by renting it out, you are making the housing available in a different way to people who don't want to buy or aren't able. Landlords can have a lot of power over people, and we need strong tenant protections to keep them accountable. But as the Rotterdam study indicated, rentals are in fact important to make housing accessible to younger people, people with lower incomes, and people with an immigrant background. Finally, the least socially useful way to make money from housing is just owning it and seeing its price go up, because the value doesn't come from anything productive that you did, for the most part. Even worse, wanting to quote-unquote protect your investment can be actively counterproductive if it leads to fighting against new housing, or trying to legally exclude less wealthy people from your neighborhood. The pervasive idea that owning housing should be a good investment that should be protected, supported, and encouraged by government policy is one of the most destructive ideas of our time, whether it comes from the multiple property owning class or just from individual homeowners. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.